My parents looked me dead in the eye and handed me a cardboard box. They had just sold the tech empire I built from scratch for $2.5 billion, and their first order of business was firing me. What they didn't know: I still owned the master keys. It all started in a cramped, humid dorm room in Austin, Texas. My name is Chloe Hastings. I was 19, surviving on black coffee and stale bagels, and I had just cracked an algorithmic problem that had been baffling Silicon Valley engineers for half a decade. I called it the Nereus Protocol. It was a localized, predictive neural network designed to compress and route massive packets of global supply chain data in microseconds. It doesn't sound sexy, but to logistics giants, it was the holy grail. It meant saving billions in operational inefficiencies. Within 3 weeks of publishing a tiny, redacted white paper on an obscure coding forum, my inbox blew up. Venture capitalists were circling like vultures. I was a brilliant coder, but I was also a deeply introverted 19-year-old girl who would rather stare at a terminal screen for 20 hours than speak in front of a crowd for 20 seconds. I was terrified. That was when my parents swooped in, Andrew and Meredith Hastings. My father was a charismatic, moderately successful commercial real estate broker who loved the sound of his own voice. My mother was a quintessential social climber, a woman who treated every country club dinner like a battlefield. When they heard about the offers rolling in, they immediately booked a first-class flight to Austin. I still remember the dinner we had at a high-end steakhouse. My father reached across the table, taking my trembling hands in his. "Chloe, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with paternal concern. "These tech bros will eat you alive. They'll take your brilliant mind, steal your work, and toss you aside. Let us protect you. Let your family handle the business." My mother chimed in, perfectly manicured hand resting over my father's. "You're the creative genius, darling. You shouldn't be bogged down with lawyers and cap tables and board meetings. You just keep building. We'll build the fortress around you." I was their only child. I loved them. I trusted them implicitly. Why wouldn't I? We formed Aura Grid Technologies, or rather, they formed it. Andrew became the chief executive officer, taking the lion's share of the media spotlight. Meredith appointed herself chief operating officer. I was given the title of lead developer, which was eventually upgraded to chief technology officer. The next 10 years were a blur of absolute, punishing labor. While Andrew and Meredith were busy gracing the covers of business magazines, attending galas in Davos, and buying a $15 million estate in the Hamptons, I was living in a windowless subterranean server room at our headquarters. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed birthdays, weddings, and holidays. I didn't date. I didn't have a life. My entire existence was devoted to refining Nereus, scaling the architecture, and keeping the company running, while our user base exploded from 100 clients to 10,000 global enterprises. Every time I asked about my equity or asked to see the financial ledgers, I was met with masterful gaslighting. "We're putting it all back into the company, Chloe," my father would say, looking mildly offended that I even brought it up. "We set up the holding company to protect our assets from liability. Everything is held in the family trust. You're making a phenomenal salary, aren't you?" I was making $200,000 a year. It sounds like a lot, until you realize my code was generating $400 million in annual recurring revenue. But I let it go. I told myself that the money didn't matter, that we were building a legacy, and that, ultimately, I was the sole heir to whatever they built. I was naive. I was so blinded by my screen and my dedication to the technology that I completely failed to see the knife being sharpened right behind my back. The subtle shifts began around year 8. The company had grown to over 600 employees. My parents started hiring executive vice presidents and senior directors, slick, smooth-talking MBAs who looked at me like I was the IT girl who had wandered upstairs by mistake. Andrew stopped inviting me to the executive summits. Meredith started making passive-aggressive comments about my wardrobe, suggesting I didn't fit the corporate aesthetic they were trying to project to potential investors. I was being isolated. walled off in my own kingdom. But the servers were my domain, and as long as I controlled the architecture, I felt secure. I assumed they just wanted to play corporate dress-up while I did the actual work. I had no idea they had spent the last 14 months negotiating the biggest tech acquisition of the decade. It was a rainy Tuesday in November. I was in the middle of debugging a critical patch for our European servers when I got a calendar ping. Mandatory executive briefing. Boardroom A. 10 a.m. Boardroom A was the glass-walled monstrosity Andrew had custom-built on the top floor. It offered panoramic views of the city skyline and intimidated everyone who walked into it. I grabbed my tablet, wiped some spilled coffee off my jeans, and took the private elevator up. When the doors opened, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Andrew was standing at the head of the massive mahogany table, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit. Meredith was seated to his right, sipping sparkling water. But they weren't alone. There were 4 unfamiliar men in the room, all wearing identical predatory smiles. Among them was Victor Kensington, the ruthless, legendary CEO of Apex Global, a massive conglomerate known for swallowing up innovative tech startups and stripping them for parts. "Ah, Chloe." "Have a seat," Andrew said. His tone wasn't paternal. It was cold, sterile, the kind of voice you use when firing a contractor. I sat down, my heart pounding a strange, heavy rhythm. "What's going on, Dad?" "We have a massive latency issue in the Frankfurt node. I need to get back down to. Leave the server issues to the new team." "Chloe," Meredith interrupted smoothly, not making eye contact. "The new team?" I echoed. Andrew cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "I'll get straight to the point. As of 9 a.m. this morning, AuraGrid Technologies has been officially acquired by Apex Global. Victor and his team have agreed to a buyout of all our outstanding shares and assets." The breath left my lungs. "Acquired? What are you talking about? We never even discussed an acquisition. I'm the CTO. You're an employee, Chloe." Andrew corrected, his voice hardening into something unrecognizable. "A highly valued one, of course, but the board, meaning your mother and I, made a unanimous executive decision. The deal is closed. The ink is dry. The total valuation is $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion. The number echoed in my head, loud and chaotic. But it wasn't the number that made my stomach drop. It was the way Victor Kensington was looking at me. Not as a partner, not as the creator of the tech he just bought. He looked at me like I was a piece of obsolete hardware. "And me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where do I fit into this?" Meredith slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany. It stopped right in front of me. "Victor brings his own proprietary management team to his acquisitions," Andrew said, refusing to look me in the eye now. "They have a very specific vision for scaling the Nereus protocol, and unfortunately, it requires a more seasoned, corporate-minded technical director. We feel, and Victor agrees, that your skill set is best suited for the startup phase. You're a builder, Chloe, not a maintainer." I stared at the envelope. I knew what it was before I even opened it. "We are letting you go, Chloe," my mother said softly, though there was a sickening hint of triumph in her voice. "It's effective immediately, but don't worry. We've secured a very generous severance package for you. $250,000, plus 6 months of continued health coverage. It's more than fair." I opened the envelope. Inside was a standard termination agreement, a non-disclosure agreement, and a non-compete clause that would bar me from working in logistics tech for 5 years. They were tossing me out with $250,000 while they walked away with $1 billion fortune each. "You're firing me?" I stood up, my chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "I built this company. I wrote every single line of the foundational code. You couldn't even turn on a server without me." "Don't be dramatic, Chloe," Andrew snapped, his public facade finally cracking. "We gave you the platform. We took the financial risk. We housed you, fed you, and managed the business while you played on your computer. You were compensated incredibly well." Now, we are cashing out our investment. That is how the real world works. Sign the severance. I looked at Victor Kensington. He just shrugged, an arrogant little smirk playing on his lips. It's just business, Miss Hastings. We have our own engineers to decipher your work. My parents, the people who were supposed to protect me from the sharks, had turned out to be the biggest great whites in the ocean. They had used my youth, my social anxiety, and my familial loyalty to systematically rob me of my life's work. They had structured the holding company so meticulously that legally I had no claim to the $2.5 billion. I looked at the severance agreement. I looked at my mother's icy, perfectly contoured face. I looked at my father, who was already glancing at his Rolex, eager for me to leave so they could pop the champagne. A terrifying, profound calmness washed over me. It was the absolute zero of human emotion. No, I said quietly. I dropped the termination papers back onto the table, unsigned. Chloe, don't be foolish, Andrew warned, his voice rising. If you don't sign that, you walk away with nothing. I'll take my chances, I said. I picked up my tablet, turned on my heel, and walked toward the glass doors. Security will escort you out, Meredith called after me, her voice shrill. You are not to touch the servers. I don't need to, I replied without looking back. They had security march me out of the building like a criminal. 2 large men flanked me as I carried my single cardboard box of personal items, a coffee mug, a mechanical keyboard, a framed photo of my dog through the lobby. I felt the eyes of my former colleagues burning into my back. Whispers followed me out into the pouring rain. I drove back to my small, overpriced apartment in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. The betrayal was so massive, so absolute, that my brain had bypassed grief and gone straight to cold, calculated vengeance. When I got home, I didn't call a therapist. I called my lawyer, a brilliant, cutthroat intellectual property attorney named Leo Finch, who I had met through an online open-source community years ago. Leo, I said when he picked up. They sold the company, Apex Global, $2.5 billion, and they fired me. There was a long pause on the other end. Andrew and Meredith? They actually did it? Jesus, Chloe, I'm so sorry. Don't be, I said, booting up my personal encrypted laptop. I need you to pull the filings from 2014, specifically the licensing agreement between AuraGrid Technologies and Crimson Owl LLC. I heard the sound of Leo furiously typing on his end. Wait, he said, his voice dropping an octave. Crimson Owl. That's the shell company you formed when you were 19, before your parents got involved. Exactly, I whispered, pulling up the original, heavily encrypted source code files on my screen. When my parents swooped in to protect me all those years ago, they brought their fancy corporate lawyers to draft the paperwork. They made sure Andrew and Meredith owned 100% of AuraGrid, but they made one catastrophic billion-dollar mistake. They assumed AuraGrid owned the Nereus protocol. They didn't. Before my parents even knew what Nereus was, I had quietly copyrighted the original architecture and assigned the intellectual property to Crimson Owl LLC, a company of which I was the sole owner and proprietor. When AuraGrid was formed, I didn't transfer the IP. I granted AuraGrid an exclusive license to use the software. My parents' lawyers were so focused on structuring the corporate equity to screw me over that they never thoroughly audited the original IP chain of title. They just saw a license agreement and assumed it was standard. I have the contract right here, Leo said, his voice suddenly trembling with a mixture of shock and sheer, unadulterated glee. Section 4, Clause B. This license is non-transferable and shall automatically terminate in the event of a change of control, acquisition, or sale of AuraGrid Technologies. A slow, dark smile spread across my face as the rain hammered against my apartment window. They had sold the company, but they didn't own the product. Apex Global had just paid $2.5 billion for an empty corporate shell. And the second the ink dried on that acquisition, AuraGrid's legal right to use my code instantly evaporated. So, Leo, I murmured, leaning back in my chair, how long do you think it will take for Victor Kensington to realize he just bought a $2 billion brick? Oh, Leo laughed, a sharp, dangerous sound. I'd give it about 48 hours. For the next 48 hours, I didn't leave my apartment. I ordered Thai takeout, brewed pot after pot of dark roast coffee, and set up a multi-monitor command center on my dining table. I wasn't hacking into AuraGrid that would be illegal. I was simply monitoring the incoming ping requests to the proprietary authentication servers hosted by Crimson Owl LLC. The Nereus protocol wasn't just a static piece of software you could copy and paste onto a flash drive. It was a living, breathing neural network. To prevent corporate espionage, I had engineered a cryptographic heartbeat into the core architecture. Every 12 hours, the AuraGrid servers had to send an encrypted handshake to my private Crimson Owl servers to verify the licensing key. If the handshake failed, Nereus would automatically initiate a localized quarantine protocol to protect the data. In layman's terms, the system would lock down, encrypt itself, and refuse to route a single packet of data until a valid license was authenticated. At 10 a.m. on Thursday, exactly 48 hours after Andrew and Meredith signed the acquisition papers and terminated my employment, the license officially expired. I sat back in my chair, nursing a cold cup of coffee, and watched the terminal on my left monitor. Incoming request. AuraGrid, Node, Frankfurt, verifying license. Error 403, license terminated, change of control detected, access denied, initiating quarantine protocol. It was beautiful. Line after line of green text scrolled down my screen as, one by one, the global nodes of the Nereus protocol realized the company had been sold. Frankfurt went dark, then Tokyo, then London. Finally, the massive server farm in Virginia shut its doors. Within 20 minutes, the logistics networks of 3 major global shipping conglomerates ground to an absolute halt. Trucks were stranded at depots. Cargo ships sat in ports waiting for routing manifests that would never arrive. Apex Global had just spent $2.5 billion, and their shiny new toy was completely, undeniably bricked. My phone started ringing at 10:45 a.m. The caller ID flashed, Andrew Hastings, mobile. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. It rang again, and again. By the 4th call, I answered, putting him on speakerphone while I typed a quick email to my lawyer, Leo. Chloe! Andrew barked. His voice lacked the smooth, rehearsed cadence he used for Forbes interviews. He sounded breathless, frantic. Where are you? Pick up the damn phone! I'm at home, Andrew, I said, my voice perfectly level. As per the termination agreement you and Meredith forced on me Tuesday morning. Listen to me, he snapped, the familiar condescension creeping back in. We have a massive system failure. The entire routing network just went offline. Apex's lead engineer, a guy named Gregory Pierce, is telling Victor that the core architecture is locked behind some sort of third-party authentication firewall. You need to get down here right now and give them the override passwords. I can't do that, I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Chloe, this is not the time for a childish tantrum, Andrew yelled, the facade entirely dropping. We just closed a $2.5 billion deal. Victor Kensington is in my office screaming about breach of contract. Get your laptop and get down here. I will pay you your quarterly bonus, but you need to fix this glitch immediately. It's not a glitch, Andrew, I said softly. It's a feature. The Nereus protocol is functioning exactly as it was designed to. There was a heavy pause on the line. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of someone shouting in the background. It sounded distinctly like Victor Kensington. What do you mean? A feature. Andrew's voice dropped, a sliver of genuine panic finally piercing his arrogance. I mean that AuraGrid Technologies never owned the Nereus protocol, I explained, articulating every word with crystal clarity. You owned an exclusive license to use it. a license granted by Crimson Owl LLC. Check the original 2014 filings. Clause 4B specifically states that the license is non-transferable and terminates instantly upon the sale of AuraGrid. You sold the company, Andrew. The license is dead, and since I am the sole proprietor of Crimson Owl, I am under no legal obligation to grant a new one to Apex Global. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my 29 years of life. It was the sound of a $2.5 billion house of cards collapsing in real time. You little bitch, Andrew hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying, impotent rage. You planned this. You set us up. I didn't set you up. I corrected him calmly. I protected myself from the very beginning. You and Mum spent 10 years trying to box me out of my own creation. You took the credit. You took the money. And then you threw me out like garbage the second you got a payday. You sold something you didn't own. I will sue you into the ground, he screamed, completely losing his mind. I am your father. I will drag you through court until you have nothing left. You can't sue me for enforcing a contract your own lawyers drafted and signed, I replied. But I have a feeling Victor Kensington is going to sue you for fraud. Good luck, Andrew. I hung up and blocked his number. Karma wasn't just knocking. It was kicking the door off its hinges. The fallout was apocalyptic. It turns out that when you sell a multi-billion-dollar tech asset to a publicly traded conglomerate without disclosing that you don't actually own the intellectual property, the Securities and Exchange Commission gets very, very angry. Within 72 hours, Apex Global's stock plummeted by 14%. Victor Kensington, a man famous for his ruthless corporate butchery, realized he had been humiliated on a global stage. He didn't just want his money back. He wanted blood. Apex Global filed a massive lawsuit against Andrew and Meredith Hastings for gross misrepresentation, breach of contract, and criminal fraud. The $2.5 billion, which had been sitting in a transitionary escrow account waiting to be dispersed to my parents' offshore trusts, was immediately frozen by a federal judge. My parents went from being the darlings of Silicon Valley to radioactive pariahs overnight. Their $15 million estate in the Hamptons was slapped with a lien. Their corporate accounts were locked. The sycophantic executives they had hired to replace me fled the company like rats from a sinking ship, terrified of being implicated in the SEC investigation. 2 weeks later, I was summoned to a mediation conference at the towering glass offices of Pearson & Croft, the elite law firm representing Apex Global. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, a far cry from the hoodies and jeans my mother used to sneer at. My lawyer, Leo Finch, walked beside me, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He looked like a shark-smelling chum in the water. When we entered the vast, mahogany-panelled conference room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Victor Kensington sat at the head of the table, flanked by 4 vicious-looking litigators. On the opposite side sat Andrew and Meredith. I almost didn't recognize them. Andrew looked 10 years older. His signature bespoke suit hung loosely on his frame, his face pale and drawn. Meredith was staring at the table, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a severe, messy knot. The arrogant, untouchable aura they had projected in Boardroom A was completely gone. They looked like what they truly were. Common con artists who had finally been caught. Miss Hastings, Victor Kensington said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as I took my seat. He didn't look at me like an obsolete piece of hardware anymore. He looked at me like I was holding a live grenade. I assume you know why we are here. I do, Mr. Kensington, I replied smoothly. Your parents sold me a fraudulent bill of goods, Victor stated, glaring at Andrew, who flinched under his gaze. They claimed full ownership of the Nereus protocol. My engineers have spent the last 14 days trying to bypass your quarantine lockdown. They can't. You built a poison pill into the architecture. If we try to forcefully extract the code, it scrambles the neural weights. It destroys the very asset we purchased. It's a standard security measure against intellectual property theft, I said, leaning back in my chair. Crimson Owl LLC takes its proprietary tech very seriously. Meredith suddenly looked up, her eyes brimming with desperate manufactured tears. Chloe, please. You have to stop this. They're trying to send us to federal prison. We're your family. We did everything for you. You can't just let them destroy us over a technicality. A technicality? Leo Finch intervened, his voice dripping with professional disdain. Mrs. Hastings, you committed wire fraud, securities fraud, and breach of contract. You attempted to sell $2 billion worth of stolen property. There is nothing technical about it. You are criminals. Shut up! Andrew snarled, slamming his fist on the table. Chloe, this is between us. You give them the access codes. And we can all walk away from this. We'll give you 20% of the payout. $500 million. Just unlock the servers. I looked at my father. I thought about the decade I spent in that windowless basement. I thought about the holidays spent alone, writing code so they could buy yachts. I thought about the manila envelope sliding across the table, offering me a pathetic severance while they stole my life's work. No, I said quietly. The word dropped like an anvil in the silent room. What do you want, Miss Hastings? Victor Kensington asked, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. You hold the keys. Name your price. My price is simple, I said, looking directly at Victor, completely ignoring my parents. Crimson Owl LLC will grant Apex Global a permanent, irrevocable license to the Nereus Protocol. Furthermore, I will personally oversee the integration and unbrick your logistics networks. Victor's eyes lit up with predatory relief. And in exchange? In exchange, Apex Global will pay Crimson Owl LLC a licensing fee of $1.5 billion, I stated. Andrew gasped, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. You can't do that. The original valuation was 2.5. I'm not finished, I said, cutting him off sharply. I get 1.5 billion. As for the remaining 1 billion from the original escrow, Apex Global keeps it. Consider it a discount for your troubles, Mr. Kensington. Victor Kensington sat back, a slow, stunned smile spreading across his face. I was offering to save his reputation, give him the tech he desperately needed, and save his company $1 billion in the process. It was the easiest business decision he would ever make. Done, Victor said instantly, extending his hand across the table. You can't do this! Meredith screamed, standing up, her chair crashing to the floor behind her. That money is ours. We built AuraGrid. We built you. You built nothing, I said, my voice cold as ice as I finally turned to look at my mother. You built a parasitic shell around my genius. And now, the shell is empty. Leo opened his briefcase and slid a single sheet of paper toward Victor's lead attorney. Apex Global will drop the civil suits against Andrew and Meredith Hastings regarding the recovery of the funds, as the funds will be returned to Apex and redirected to Crimson Owl, Leo explained clinically. However, my client requires that Apex Global fully cooperates with the SEC and the Department of Justice regarding the criminal fraud investigation into Andrew and Meredith Hastings. Andrew collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was ruined. They wouldn't get a single dime from the sale. Their reputations were permanently incinerated. They would likely spend the next 5 years fighting federal indictments, draining whatever legitimate savings they had left on criminal defense attorneys. They had tried to fire me and steal a fortune. Instead, they had bankrupted themselves and handed me the keys to the kingdom. I stood up, buttoning my suit jacket. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. We'll send over the transfer protocols once the wire clears, I told Victor, as I walked out of the conference room. The sound of my parents' desperate, panicked sobbing echoed off the mahogany walls. I didn't look back. I had a company to run. It took exactly 4 months to fully unbrick the global logistics network and integrate the Nereus protocol into Apex Global's massive proprietary infrastructure. Victor Kensington, despite being a ruthless corporate predator, turned out to be a surprisingly straightforward business partner once he realized I was holding the leash. I didn't work in a windowless subterranean server room anymore. Apex gave me a sprawling top-floor corner suite in their Seattle headquarters, complete with a dedicated team of 50 senior engineers who actually listened to my directives. When the $1.5 billion wire transfer hit the private accounts of Crimson Owl LLC, I happened to be sitting at my desk eating a lukewarm slice of pepperoni pizza. I opened my banking portal, stared at the 10-digit number for about 3 minutes, and then closed the tab. I didn't go out and buy a fleet of sports cars. I didn't buy a mega yacht. The very first thing I did was wire Leo Finch, my attorney, a $10 million bonus. The second thing I did was set up a massive philanthropic trust for underrepresented women in computer science. The money was a shield, a fortress that ensured no one would ever be able to exploit me again. My parents, however, were experiencing a very different kind of reality. The settlement with Apex Global only absolved them of civil liability regarding the stolen funds. It did absolutely nothing to protect them from the federal government. The Securities and Exchange Commission, tipped off by the chaotic implosion of the acquisition, had handed the file over to the Department of Justice. Specifically, the case landed on the desk of a notoriously aggressive prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. To build their case, the DOJ brought in a team of forensic accountants from Deloitte to tear through AuraGrid's financial history. What they found was a masterclass in corporate gluttony. My parents hadn't just tried to defraud Apex Global. They had been systematically misappropriating AuraGrid's capital for nearly 6 years. The $15 million Hamptons estate, financed through a shell company and written off as an executive retreat center for tax purposes, first-class flights to Street, Bart's, Andrew's bespoke wardrobe, Meredith's 6-figure country club memberships, all fraudulently categorized as research and development expenses. When the IRS caught wind of the Deloitte audit, the situation escalated from a white-collar scandal to a devastating criminal nightmare. Andrew and Meredith's assets were entirely frozen under federal injunction. They desperately tried to retain the elite defense attorneys at Kirkland and Ellis, the kind of lawyers who charge $2,000 an hour and make federal charges magically disappear. But Kirkland and Ellis required a $5 million upfront retainer, and my parents' bank accounts were locked down tighter than a military server. They were forced to settle for a mid-tier, overworked defense firm that specialized in negotiating plea deals rather than fighting in court. 10 months after the fateful meeting in Boardroom A, the hammer finally fell. Andrew and Meredith were formally indicted on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of securities fraud, and 1 massive count of tax evasion. The media, which had spent years fawning over them as the visionary architects of AuraGrid, turned on them with vicious delight. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page exposé titled "The Billion-Dollar Brick: How Silicon Valley's Favorite Parents Stole Their Daughter's Code and Lost It All." They became cautionary tales, pariahs in the social circles they had sacrificed my youth to climb into. The last time I ever saw my father was on a brisk Tuesday morning in October, nearly a year after I had been escorted out of my own company by security. I had moved the permanent headquarters of Crimson Owl LLC to a beautiful, open-concept campus in Austin. I was walking across the sunlit courtyard, heading toward the main engineering bay, when I saw him standing near the visitor gates. He was unrecognizable. The charismatic, imposing CEO in the tailored Brioni suits was gone. Andrew looked hollowed out, his posture slumped, his hair drastically thinned and completely grey. He wore an ill-fitting trench coat, and his hands were trembling as he clutched a cheap faux leather briefcase. My security team stepped forward to intercept him, but I raised a hand, signaling them to hold back. I walked up to the wrought iron gate, keeping the heavy metal bars between us. "Chloe," he choked out, his voice cracking. He didn't sound angry or condescending anymore. He just sounded pitiful. I've been trying to reach you. Your lawyers keep sending cease and desist letters." "For good reason, Andrew," I said, my voice perfectly neutral. "What do you want?" Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. "We're going to prison, Chloe. The prosecutors are offering a plea deal, 48 months for me, 36 for your mother, in a minimum security facility." If we take it to trial, the judge could give us 10 years, but we have nothing left. The IRS seized the Hamptons house. They auctioned the cars. We can't even pay our legal bills. He reached through the bars, his trembling fingers reaching for my sleeve. But I took a calculated step back. Please, he begged, openly sobbing now in the middle of my corporate courtyard. You have over $1 billion. You won. You proved your point. Just pay for a decent legal team. Talk to the judge. Tell them it was a family misunderstanding. Tell them we didn't mean to defraud Apex. If you just write a letter of leniency, they might drop the charges to probation. You're my daughter. Please, Chloe. I'm begging you. I stood there, looking at the man who had looked me dead in the eye and handed me a cardboard box containing my entire life. I remembered the manila envelope. I remembered the non-compete clause designed to ruin my career. I remembered the arrogant smirk he shared with Victor Kensington as they tried to erase me from my own legacy. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel a desire for revenge. I just felt a profound, absolute emptiness toward the man standing in front of me. You aren't going to prison because of a family misunderstanding, Andrew, I said, my voice calm, steady, and incredibly quiet. You are going to prison because you committed federal fraud. You tried to sell stolen property. You spent a decade treating me like a machine, and when you thought the machine was no longer useful, you tried to throw it away. We were trying to protect you, he cried out, recycling the same tired lie from the steakhouse all those years ago. No, I replied, turning my back to him. You were protecting your investment, but you forgot to check who held the keys. I won't write a letter, Andrew, and I won't pay your lawyers. Have a good life. I walked away as he collapsed against the heavy iron gates, his cries echoing across the campus, ignored by the brilliant engineers who were busy building the future inside. In the end, business is just like code. It is a rigid system of inputs and outputs, of actions and consequences. My parents believed they could hack this system by exploiting the one variable they assumed would never change, a daughter's unconditional loyalty. They were entirely wrong. They sold a fragile empire for billions of dollars, but they forgot the most fundamental rule of technology. The creator always retains root access.